The summer heat in West Texas was the kind that made the horizon shimmer like water, turning distant mesas into wavering mirages. It was 1867, and the small trading post outside Fort Concho sat at the edge of two worlds, one pushing west with relentless determination, the other holding on to land that had been theirs since before memory. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, her fingers still dusty from sorting through the latest shipment of flour and coffee beans. At 23, she'd already buried a husband to cholera and watched her family's farm in Missouri crumble under debt. The trading post was her last attempt at something resembling independence, a small wooden structure that smelled of tobacco, leather, and the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken territory. She didn't hear him approach. That's what she would remember later, how quietly he moved despite his size. "You have sugar?" Sarah turned, startled, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle she kept beneath the counter. But she stopped when she saw him standing in the doorway, backlit by the brutal afternoon sun. He was Comanche. That much was clear from his buckskin clothing and the way he wore his hair, long and unbound. But there was something else about him, something in the way he stood at the threshold rather than entering, in the careful English of his question. "I have sugar," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "How much do you need?" He stepped inside, and she could see him better now. He was perhaps her age, maybe a year or two older, with dark eyes that took in everything about the trading post in a single sweep, the arrangement of goods, the windows, the rifle's position, her. He moved with the controlled economy of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, hunting, surviving. £2, he said. "I have money." That surprised her. Most of the Comanche who occasionally came through traded furs or beadwork. Money meant he'd been working with settlers, maybe even the army. It meant something about the changing world they were both navigating. "That'll be 30 cents, Sarah said, moving to weigh out the sugar. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she hated herself for it. She dealt with drunk cowboys and aggressive traders without flinching, but something about this quiet man unsettled her in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He placed the coins on the counter. Exact change. Their fingers didn't touch, but she felt the proximity like static electricity before a storm. "You run this place alone?" he asked. "I do now," Sarah replied, wrapping the sugar in brown paper. "My husband died 2 years ago." She didn't know why she told him that. It wasn't information she shared freely. Most men in these parts saw a widow as either pitiable or available, neither of which interested her. "That is hard," he said simply, and there was something in his tone, not pity but recognition. "I am called Running Wolf. My Comanche name is Tamakera, but white people cannot say it well. Sarah Mitchell." She handed him the package, "and I might surprise you with my pronunciation if you gave me a chance." The corner of his mouth lifted, barely a smile, but it transformed his face from stoic to almost boyish. "Tamakera," he said slowly. "It means runs with wolf." "Tamakera," Sarah repeated, and while her accent was far from perfect, she saw the flicker of appreciation in his eyes. "Close enough, Sarah Mitchell." He left then, as quietly as he'd arrived, and Sarah stood alone in the trading post, feeling like the temperature had somehow shifted, like a storm was building on a cloudless day. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like him, Comanche warriors in a territory increasingly controlled by the army and settlers, they passed through and vanished like morning mist. But 3 days later, he returned. This time, he needed ammunition. 20 rounds of .44 caliber for a rifle she suspected he'd taken from a dead soldier, though she'd never ask. It was the unspoken rule of the trading post: don't ask questions that force uncomfortable answers. "You hunt?" she asked instead, counting out the bullets. "When I can," Tamakera replied. "Buffalo are harder to find now. The white hunters take them all, leave the bodies to rot." There was no accusation in his voice, just stating fact. But Sarah felt the weight of it anyway, the awareness that she was part of the world that was destroying his. "That's wasteful," she said quietly. "My father always taught me to use everything we took from the land. Nothing wasted." "Your father was wise." Tamakera met her eyes. "Most settlers do not think this way." Most people don't think, period, Sarah said, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. They just take and take until there's nothing left. Something shifted in the space between them, recognition maybe, or the beginning of understanding that they weren't as different as geography suggested. The Comanche take only what we need, Tamakera said. The buffalo gives us everything: food, shelter, tools, clothing. We honor the gift. I'd like to learn about that, Sarah said before she could stop herself. About how you use everything. Tamakera studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for something, mockery perhaps, or the casual curiosity of settlers who collected stories like souvenirs. You are serious, he said finally. It wasn't a question. I am. Then I will teach you, he said, if you teach me something in return. What could I possibly teach you? How to survive in their world. Tamakera gestured vaguely toward the fort in the distance. The white man's world. It is coming whether we want it or not. I need to understand it better. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking but opening like a door she hadn't known was there. Deal, she said, extending her hand. Tamakera looked at her outstretched hand, then grasped it firmly. His palm was calloused, warm, and the handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary. When? Sarah asked. Sunset. 3 days from now. There is a place by the creek, half-mile north of here. You will find it. He left again, and Sarah stood in the trading post trying to understand what she'd just agreed to. Teaching and learning, he'd said. But she suspected they were both after something more fundamental. Connection in a world that seemed determined to keep them separate. The next 3 days crawled by with excruciating slowness. Sarah found herself watching the trail north, wondering what she was getting herself into. The sensible part of her brain, the part that had learned to survive on the frontier through caution and calculation, screamed warnings. Meeting secretly with a Comanche warrior? It was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety and everything to do with how people would see her, what they would say. But another part of her, a part she'd buried beneath 2 years of survival mode, whispered something different. It whispered about curiosity and connection, about the possibility of seeing the world through different eyes. On the third evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sarah locked the trading post and walked north. The creek was easy to find, a thin ribbon of water that somehow persisted through the Texas summer, lined with cottonwoods that provided rare shade. Tamakera was already there, sitting on a flat rock near the water. He rose when he saw her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance. You came, he said. I said I would. Many people say things they do not mean. I'm not most people, Sarah said, and realized with a start that it was true. She'd never been most people, had never quite fit the mold of what a woman was supposed to be. Demure, dependent, decorative. The frontier had stripped away the pretense, left only what was essential. No, Tamakera agreed, something like approval in his voice. You are not. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because the next 5 chapters will take you deeper into a story of forbidden connection, impossible choices, and the kind of love that rewrites everything you thought you knew about belonging. Winter came hard and early that year, bringing snow to West Texas by Thanksgiving, rare enough to be notable, disruptive enough to slow everything down. The trading post's business trickled to almost nothing as settlers hunkered down and Comanche bands moved to their winter camps. Sarah and Tamakera met less frequently, but with greater intensity. Each meeting felt stolen from the jaws of a world conspiring against them. They talked for hours in the freezing cold, wrapped in buffalo robes that Tamakera brought, speaking of futures that seemed increasingly impossible. Come with me, he said one night in December, his breath visible in the frigid air. To my band's winter camp. You could see how we live, meet my people. They'd never accept me, Sarah said. Some would not, Tamakera admitted, but some might. My aunt, she is wise, open-minded. She would see what I see in you. And what do you see in me? He touched her face, his fingers cold but his eyes warm. Someone who belongs nowhere because she belongs everywhere. Someone who understands that the old categories no longer fit the world we are making. What world are we making? Sarah asked. Because from where I'm standing it looks like just more destruction. Maybe, Tamakera said quietly. Or maybe we are the small beginning of something different. People who refuse to choose sides because the sides themselves are false. It was a beautiful idea. It was also probably fatal. The crisis came on a bitter January afternoon. Sarah was restocking shelves when the door burst open, and Tamakera stumbled in, blood running from a gash on his forehead. "Lock the door," he gasped. Sarah didn't hesitate, dropping the bar across the door and grabbing the rifle. "What happened?" "Morrison. Found me hunting on what he claims is settler land. Tried to arrest me, I ran." He pressed a hand to his head, blood seeping between his fingers. "He is coming, with more soldiers. We need to hide you." "There is nowhere to hide. This building has one door, no back exit." Sarah's mind raced. He was right. The trading post had been built for commerce, not defense. If Morrison arrived with soldiers, there was no escape. "Then we face him together," she said. Tamakera shook his head. "Sarah, no. You cannot be seen protecting me. It will destroy you." "I think we're past that point. I will not let you—" "This isn't your choice," Sarah interrupted. "I choose this. I choose you." The pounding on the door came before he could respond. Morrison's voice, sharp with authority and underlying cruelty. "Mrs. Mitchell, open up. We know he's in there." Sarah and Tamakera looked at each other across the small space of the trading post. Everything they were, everything they'd built in secret meetings and whispered conversations, came down to this moment. "When I open the door," Sarah whispered, "stay behind the counter. Let me talk first." "Sarah, trust me." She took a deep breath and lifted the bar, pulling the door open. Morrison stood there with 4 soldiers, all armed, all looking eager for violence. "Lieutenant," Sarah said coolly, "what brings you out in this weather?" "Don't play stupid, ma'am. We tracked a hostile here. Hand him over." "I don't know what you're talking about." Morrison pushed past her into the trading post, and his soldiers followed. They found Tamakera immediately. There was nowhere to hide in the small space. "Well, well," Morrison said, his hand moving to his pistol. "Looks like we've got ourselves an Indian lover and her pet savage." "He's wounded and unarmed," Sarah said sharply. "And on my property." "You have no right." "I have every right," Morrison interrupted. "This hostile is wanted for trespassing on settler land and resisting arrest. He's coming with us." "On what authority?" "Show me the warrant." Morrison's smile was vicious. "Don't need a warrant for an Indian, ma'am. They're barely human, case you hadn't noticed. Now step aside." What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Morrison reached for Tamakera. Tamakera, backed against the counter with nowhere to go, grabbed the first thing his hand found, a heavy iron skillet Sarah used for cooking. He swung it hard, catching Morrison across the shoulder, not hard enough to seriously injure, but hard enough to stagger him. The soldiers raised their rifles. "No!" Sarah screamed, throwing herself between Tamakera and the guns. Everything froze. 4 rifles pointed at her chest, Morrison recovering his balance, Tamakera behind her breathing hard. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison said carefully, "step aside. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" Sarah's laugh was slightly hysterical. "You're about to murder a man in my trading post, and you're worried about making it worse. He assaulted an officer. You broke into my property and threatened him. He defended himself." "Sarah," Tamakera said quietly behind her, "please move. No. If you do this, they will destroy you. They're going to kill you." "I have lived a full life," Tamakera said, and his voice was steady, almost peaceful. "But you have so much time left. Do not waste it dying for me." "I'm not wasting anything," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I'm choosing. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing exactly what I want." Morrison made an impatient sound. "This is touching, really. But I'm giving you one last chance, ma'am. Step aside, or be arrested as an accomplice." Sarah looked at the rifles pointed at her, at Morrison's cold eyes, at the certainty of violence that filled the trading post like smoke. Then she looked at the soldiers, young men, most of them, barely older than boys. Farm kids and factory workers who'd enlisted for steady pay, not philosophical debates about justice. "Look at yourselves," she said, addressing the soldiers directly. "Look at what you're doing. This man came here wounded, asking for help. I gave it to him. That's not a crime, that's basic human decency. Are you really prepared to shoot a woman to get to him?" One of the soldiers, couldn't have been more than 19, shifted uncomfortably. "Lieutenant, maybe we should just—" "Quiet," Morrison snapped, then to Sarah. "Last warning." "Then shoot me," Sarah said, "because I'm not moving." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Morrison's finger tightened on his trigger, and Sarah closed her eyes, wondering if this was how it would end, not with passionate declaration, but with cold calculation and a bullet through the chest. "Stand down." The new voice came from the doorway. Sarah opened her eyes to see Captain James Hartwell, Morrison's commanding officer, standing in the doorway with 2 more soldiers. "Sir, this woman is protecting a hostile," Morrison began. "I said stand down, Lieutenant." Hartwell's voice was ice. "Lower your weapons." The soldiers complied, looking relieved. Morrison's face went purple with rage, but he holstered his pistol. Hartwell stepped into the trading post, taking in the scene with shrewd eyes, the blood on Tamakera's forehead, Sarah standing protectively in front of him, the obvious standoff that had just ended. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hartwell said, "are you all right?" "I am now," Sarah said, though she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Hartwell turned to Tamakera. "You're running wolf, aren't you? I've heard about you. They say you're one of the few who tries to keep the peace." Tamakera said nothing, his face carefully blank. "Here's what's going to happen," Hartwell said. "Running wolf, you're going to leave this trading post and not come back, period. Mrs. Mitchell, you're going to stop whatever this is," he gestured between them, "before it gets both of you killed. And Lieutenant Morrison is going to return to the fort and think very carefully about his actions today." "But, sir," Morrison protested, "that's an order, Lieutenant, and if I hear one more report of you exceeding your authority, you'll be court-martialed. Am I clear?" Morrison's jaw worked, but he finally nodded. "Crystal, sir." "Good. Now everyone get out of here before I change my mind about arresting the lot of you." The soldiers filed out, Morrison last, shooting Sarah a look of pure hatred as he left. When they were gone, Hartwell turned back to Sarah and Tamakera. "I meant what I said. This has to stop." "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked. Hartwell sighed. "Because I'm tired of unnecessary death, Mrs. Mitchell. I've been in this territory long enough to know that Morrison's approach only breeds more violence. But I can only protect you once. If this continues, if there's another incident, I won't be able to stop what happens next." He left, and Sarah and Tamakera were alone in the trading post's wreckage, overturned goods, spilled flour, the tang of blood and fear in the air. "You almost died for me," Tamakera said quietly. "Would have died for you," Sarah corrected. "Gladly." "Why?" She turned to face him. This man who'd become her whole world, without her quite realizing when it happened. "Because loving you is the first true thing I've done in my entire life. Everything else, the marriage, moving west, the trading post, those were all things that happened to me. But loving you, that's a choice I make every single day." If you felt your heart break just now, type, "I would have stood in front of those rifles too," in the comments. Let me know you're here, feeling this with them. Winter deepened, and with it, the impossible reality of their situation. Captain Hartwell had been clear. Stop or face consequences that would destroy them both. Morrison was waiting for any excuse to finish what he'd started. The entire territory seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the violence everyone knew was coming. Sarah and Tamakera didn't meet for 3 weeks after the standoff. It was agony, knowing he was out there somewhere, knowing she couldn't go to him, knowing that their forced separation was just another form of defeat. But on a Thursday evening in late January, he appeared at the trading post just before closing. Sarah's heart leapt at the sight of him, then crashed when she saw his face. "We need to talk," he said. They sat in the back room where Sarah did her accounting, the ledger books and the smell of ink somehow making everything feel more real and more impossible at the same time. "My band is leaving," Tamakera said without preamble. "Moving north, trying to find territory where the army patrols are less frequent. They want me to come. Will you?" "I do not know." That is why I came. To ask what you want." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. What I want? Tamakera, what I want is impossible. Tell me anyway. She took a shaky breath. I want you to stay. I want us to build a life together, not hiding, not secret, but real. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to learn everything about your world and teach you everything about mine. I want, her voice broke, I want what we can never have. Why can never? Because they won't let us. Sarah gestured wildly toward the world beyond the trading post. You saw what happened. Morrison wants to kill you. The army barely tolerates you. My own people think I'm insane for even talking to you. There's no place for us. Not here. Not anywhere. Then we make a place, Tamakera said simply. How? How do we possibly? We leave, he said. Together. Go somewhere neither Comanche nor white settlers control. Mexico, maybe, or California. Somewhere we can start new. Sarah stared at him, hope and terror warring in her chest. You'd leave your people for me? I left them years ago, Sarah. I just never admitted it. I walk between worlds, remember? But I am tired of walking between. I want to walk with someone. With you. It would mean giving up everything. Everything we had is already gone, Tamakera said. The buffalo, the free plains, the old ways, all disappearing. My people are being pushed onto reservations, turned into something we were never meant to be. Staying is just choosing which cage to die in. At least this way I choose the direction of my own life. And if it doesn't work, if we get there and find out there's no place for us anywhere, then at least we tried. At least we lived honestly instead of hiding. He reached across the small table, taking her hands in his. I have spent my whole life surviving, Sarah. I want to spend what is left of it living, with you. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. When would we leave? Soon. Before the spring thaw, when Morrison and his soldiers can travel freely again. We have maybe 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the weather holds. That's not much time to prepare. No, Tamakera agreed, but it is what we have. Over the following days they made plans in stolen moments. Sarah would sell the trading post, or rather pretend to close it for the season while actually liquidating everything she could. Tamakera would gather supplies for the journey, weapons and tools, and dried food that could last them the months it would take to reach California. It should have felt exciting, this grand plan of escape and new beginnings. Instead, it felt like grief. Every item Sarah packed away was something she'd never see again. Every conversation with regular customers carried the weight of goodbye without being able to say it. She was leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, for a future that might not even exist. One evening, old Mrs. Henderson came into the trading post, a widow herself, one of the few people in town who'd shown Sarah genuine kindness. You're leaving, aren't you? Mrs. Henderson said without preamble. Sarah froze. I don't know what you mean. Child, I'm 73 years old. I've seen people packing up their lives enough times to recognize it. You're leaving, and it's because of him, the Comanche man. There was no point denying it. Yes. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My husband was Mexican, did you know that? Back when Texas was still Mexico before the Revolution. When borders changed, suddenly the man I loved was on the wrong side of a line drawn by politicians who'd never even been here. People told me to leave him, said it wasn't proper, said our marriage wasn't legitimate in the eyes of Texas law. What did you do? Sarah asked. Told them to go to hell, Mrs. Henderson said with a small smile. Loved my Juan for 42 years, right up until he died in my arms. Never regretted a single day, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones, truth be told. Those were the days that proved the love was real. She reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. Don't let small-minded people dictate your life, child. You only get one go at this. Make it count. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah sat alone in the darkening trading post and cried, for the kindness, for the validation, for the reminder that love had always required courage and probably always would. By mid-February, they were nearly ready. Sarah had sold most of her inventory quietly, converting it to cash she could carry. Tamakera had 2 horses prepared, packed with enough supplies to get them to Santa Fe at least, where they could resupply before pushing on to California. "One more week," Tamakera said when they met at their old spot by the creek. The water was frozen solid now, but they still came out of habit, out of the need for this place that had become sacred to them. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "So am I. What if we're making a terrible mistake?" Tamakera pulled her close and she breathed in the smell of him, smoke and leather, and something wild that civilization could never quite tame. "Then we make it together. That is all I know how to promise you." "It's enough," Sarah said, and meant it. 3 days before they were set to leave, Morrison came back. He arrived at the trading post in late afternoon with a new group of soldiers, younger men, harder men, the kind who saw Indians as target practice rather than people. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison said, his smile cold as the winter wind, "heard you're closing up shop, heading back east." "That's right," Sarah said, keeping her voice level though her heart was pounding. "Interesting timing, right around when we got reports that Running Wolf has gone missing. His band says he disappeared a few weeks back. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Why would I?" "Because you're a liar and an Indian lover," Morrison said, dropping the pretense of civility. "And I know you're planning something. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where he is, or I'm going to burn this trading post to the ground with you in it." Sarah's blood went cold. "You're insane." "I'm protecting civilization," Morrison corrected, "from savages and the white women stupid enough to betray their own kind." He gestured to his soldiers, who began spreading out through the trading post, knocking over shelves, smashing bottles, making it clear this wasn't an idle threat. "Last chance," Morrison said. "Where is he?" Sarah opened her mouth, unsure what she was going to say, when the door burst open and Tamakera stood there, rifle in hand. "Leave her alone," he said quietly. Morrison's smile widened. "Well, well. The savage comes to save his whore. How touching. I said leave her alone." Tamakera's finger tightened on the trigger. "Walk away, Morrison. This does not have to end in blood." "Oh, but it does," Morrison said. "It always does with your kind. You're all violent animals, every last one of you." What happened next unfolded in horrible slow motion. Morrison drew his pistol. Tamakera fired first, but his shot went wide. Deliberately, Sarah realized later, he couldn't bring himself to kill even Morrison. The lieutenant's return fire didn't miss. Tamakera fell, blood blooming across his chest. Sarah screamed, running to him as soldiers rushed forward. She covered his body with hers, sobbing, while Morrison stood over them both. "Take her to the fort," Morrison said. "Charge her with aiding a hostile, and get that body out of here." "He's not dead," Sarah screamed, feeling Tamakera's breath still moving, faint but there. "He's not dead, please, he needs a doctor." "He's a dead Indian," Morrison said coldly, "just doesn't know it yet." They dragged Sarah away from Tamakera's bleeding body, dragged her out of the trading post while she fought and screamed, and finally went limp with despair. The last thing she saw before they threw her on a horse was Tamakera's hand, still reaching toward her across the wooden floor. The cell at Fort Concho was exactly as miserable as Sarah expected. Cold stone, thin blanket, no windows. They'd thrown her in there 3 days ago and left her with nothing but her thoughts and the terrible not knowing. Was Tamakera alive? Had anyone even tried to help him? Or had Morrison simply let him bleed out on the floor of the trading post, another dead Indian to add to the territory's grim tally? The not knowing was torture worse than any physical punishment. On the 4th day, Captain Hartwell came to see her. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, pulling up a chair outside the cell bars, "you're in serious trouble." "Is he alive?" Sarah asked immediately. "Tamakera Running Wolf, is he alive?" Hartwell hesitated, and Sarah's heart dropped. "He's alive," the captain said finally. "Barely. The bullet went through his shoulder, missed the lung by inches. He's tough, I'll give him that." Sarah sagged against the wall in relief. "Where is he?" "Being held in the stockade. Morrison wanted him hanged immediately, but I blocked it pending investigation." Hartwell leaned forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand how bad this is. You're being charged with aiding a hostile, conspiracy against the United States, and 6 other crimes Morrison's creative mind invented. If convicted, you're looking at years in prison. maybe execution. "I don't care," Sarah said. "Let me see him, please." "I can't do that." "Captain, please." "Listen to me," Hartwell interrupted, his voice urgent. "There might be a way out of this, but you have to trust me, and you have to stay quiet. Can you do that?" Sarah studied his face, looking for deception, but saw only exhaustion and something that might have been sympathy. "What kind of way out?" "The territorial judge arrives in 2 days for the circuit court. I've managed to delay your trial until then. Judge Harrison is a fair man, maybe the only truly fair man in this whole God-forsaken territory. He won't be swayed by Morrison's hysteria." "And you think he'll acquit me?" "I think if you tell the truth, the real truth, all of it, he might show mercy." "But Sarah," Hartwell's voice gentled, "you need to understand that the best possible outcome still means losing everything. The trading post, your reputation, probably your ability to ever live normally in Texas again. I already lost everything that matters when Morrison shot Tamakera," Sarah said quietly. "Everything else is just details." The trial was held in the fort's makeshift courtroom, really just the mess hall with a judge's bench brought in from San Antonio. Half the fort turned out to watch, along with settlers from nearby homesteads who'd heard about the Indian-loving woman who'd betrayed her own kind. Sarah sat in the defendant's chair, wearing the same dirty dress she'd been in for a week, her hair unwashed, her face pale, but her spine straight. Across the room, in the section reserved for witnesses, Tamakera sat under guard. He was alive, but the bandages wrapped around his shoulder were spotted with blood, and his face was grey with pain. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that glance, Sarah felt everything they couldn't say. "I love you. I'm sorry. I'd do it all again." Judge Harrison was exactly as Hartwell had described, a stern man in his 60s, with intelligent eyes and the air of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness to be easily shocked. He listened to Morrison's accusations with a neutral expression, occasionally making notes. Then it was Sarah's turn to speak. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge said, "do you understand the charges against you?" "I do, Your Honor." "How do you plead?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was it, the moment to lie, to claim she'd been coerced or manipulated, to save herself by throwing Tamakera to the wolves. Morrison was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for her to seal the Comanche warrior's fate. "Guilty," Sarah said clearly. "I plead guilty to everything, to meeting with Running Wolf in secret, to teaching him to read and write, to learning about his culture, to falling in love with him, to protecting him when Lieutenant Morrison tried to murder him in my trading post. I'm guilty of all of it, and I don't regret a single moment." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison shot to his feet. "Your Honor, she's admitted her crimes. I demand immediate sentencing." "Sit down, Lieutenant," Judge Harrison said mildly. "Mrs. Mitchell, am I to understand you're claiming self-defense in the shooting?" "Not self-defense for me, Your Honor. Self-defense for Tamakera, Running Wolf. Lieutenant Morrison broke into my property, threatened an unarmed wounded man, and drew his weapon first. Running Wolf was defending himself and me." "That's a lie," Morrison shouted. "Is it?" Sarah met his eyes. "Then why did you order your men to drag me away before any doctor could see to Running Wolf's wounds? Why did you tell them to remove his body? Those were your words, weren't they? Get that body out of here, as if you fully expected him to die and wanted to make sure there was no witness to how it happened." Judge Harrison's expression darkened. "Lieutenant Morrison, did you deny medical treatment to the wounded man?" Morrison's jaw worked. "He's a hostile, Your Honor. There are no requirements. Did you deny him medical treatment, yes or no?" "I saw no reason to waste Army resources on—" "That's a yes," the judge said. "And you ordered Mrs. Mitchell removed from the scene before calling for a doctor. She was interfering." "Lieutenant, I'm going to give you some advice," Judge Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Stop talking, right now." He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to tell me, in your own words, everything that happened. Start from the beginning." So Sarah did. She told the whole story, the first meeting at the trading post, the lessons by the creek, the growing connection that became love. She didn't shy away from any of it, didn't try to make it more palatable for the shocked audience. She told them about the cultural exchange, about learning that the categories they'd built their world on, savage and civilized, white and Indian, us and them, were lies that served only to justify cruelty. She told them about Morrison's first threats, about the standoff in the trading post when Captain Hartwell had intervened. She described the weeks of hiding, the desperate plan to leave Texas for somewhere they might build a life together, and finally she told them about Morrison's return, about his threats to burn down the trading post, about Tamakera arriving to protect her, and Morrison shooting him in cold blood. He fired in self-defense, Sarah concluded, and he still missed deliberately. Even when facing death, Tamakera couldn't bring himself to kill. That's the kind of man he is. That's the man I fell in love with. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Morrison seemed stunned by the raw honesty of it. Judge Harrison looked at Tamakera. "Young man, do you wish to speak?" Tamakera rose slowly, his wounded shoulder making the movement painful. "I only want to say that Sarah Mitchell is the finest person I have ever known. She risked everything for me, her business, her reputation, her life. If the white man's law says this is wrong, then the law is broken, not what we did." "Sit down," Morrison hissed at one of his soldiers who'd started to applaud. Judge Harrison made a note, then looked up. "I'm going to need some time to consider this. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." That night, Sarah lay in her cell, unable to sleep. Everything depended on Harrison's ruling. If he sided with Morrison, she and Tamakera were both finished. If he showed mercy, well, she didn't even know what mercy would look like in this situation. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed. Word had spread through the fort and beyond, and everyone wanted to see how the story of the Indian-loving woman would end. Judge Harrison took his seat and surveyed the room with stern eyes. "I've spent considerable time reviewing this case and consulting the relevant laws. What I've concluded is that this is one of the most complicated situations I've ever encountered, legally and morally." He looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, your actions were, by the strict letter of the law, illegal. You did provide aid to a member of what the government considers a hostile nation. You did interfere with military operations. By the harshest interpretation, you could indeed face years in prison." Sarah's heart sank. "However," Harrison continued, "the law also recognizes the right to self-defense and defense of property. Lieutenant Morrison, by his own admission and the testimony of witnesses, did break into your trading post with hostile intent. He did threaten your person and property, and most damningly he did deny medical treatment to a wounded man with the clear expectation that man would die before anyone could document his injuries." Morrison went pale. "Furthermore," the judge said, "I find the entire premise of these charges to be morally bankrupt. Mrs. Mitchell is being prosecuted not for any real crime, but for the crime of seeing humanity where our society tells her she should see savagery, for the crime of love across a boundary that exists only because we decided to draw it." The courtroom erupted in gasps and arguments. Harrison banged his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" When the room quieted, he continued. "Here is my ruling. The charges against Sarah Mitchell are dismissed, all of them." Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief. "As for Running Wolf," Harrison looked at Tamakera, "you fired a weapon at a U.S. military officer. By law, I should have you hanged. But given the circumstances, that you were wounded, threatened, and defending yourself and Mrs. Mitchell, I'm choosing a different path. You are hereby banished from Texas territory. You have 1 week to leave and never return. If you're found here after that, the sentence will be carried out. It wasn't perfect, but it was life. It was a chance." "However," Harrison said, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly, "I note that California is not part of Texas territory, nor is New Mexico, nor is Mexico itself. I suggest you find somewhere peaceful to live out your days, Mr. Running Wolf, somewhere far from men like Lieutenant Morrison." The message was clear. Go and don't come back, but go together and build that life you wanted. "As for you, Lieutenant Morrison," Harrison's voice hardened again, "you are to face a military tribunal for excessive use of force, denial of medical treatment, destruction of civilian property, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Captain Hartwell will see to the arrangements." Morrison looked like he'd been punched. "Your Honor, you can't—" "I can, and I have. This court is adjourned." They left Texas at dawn a week later. on 2 horses packed with supplies and carrying everything they owned that mattered, which turned out to be very little beyond each other. Mrs. Henderson had come to see Sarah off, pressing a small leather pouch into her hands. "My wedding ring," she explained when Sarah tried to refuse it. "Juan gave it to me, and I wore it every day of our marriage. I want you to have it, for luck, and to remember that love always finds a way." Captain Hartwell had quietly arranged for medical supplies and extra ammunition to be lost in their direction. He didn't say goodbye. That would have been too much of an admission. But Sarah saw him watching from the fort as they rode away, and she nodded her thanks. The journey to California took 4 months. They traveled slowly, Tamakera's shoulder still healing, both of them learning to be free in a way neither had experienced before. They weren't white or Comanche, settler or Indian. They were just themselves. 2 people making a path through a world that had no category for what they were. They settled in a small valley in Northern California, far from anywhere that either of their past lives could reach them. Sarah opened another trading post, and Tamakera hunted and helped run it. The local Chinese and Mexican settlers didn't care much about Texas politics or racial boundaries. They had their own struggles, and found Sarah and Tamakera no stranger than anyone else on the frontier. They married in a quiet ceremony, performed by a Mexican priest who asked no questions about their history. They built a small house with both white and Comanche architectural elements, a true hybrid of their 2 worlds. They learned each other's languages fluently, and taught both to the children who eventually came. For 23 years, they lived that impossible life they'd chosen. They grew old together, built a community that accepted them, created something neither Texas nor the Comanche Plains could have allowed them. And then in 1890, influenza swept through California. It took Tamakera first. His still weakened lungs from the old bullet wound couldn't fight it off. He died in Sarah's arms, his last words in Comanche, telling her he'd wait for her wherever people went after death. Sarah followed him 3 days later. Whether it was the flu or simply a broken heart, no one could say. They were buried side by side in the valley, under cottonwood trees that reminded them both of that creek in Texas, where everything had begun. The graves have simple markers: Tamakera, Running Wolf, Mitchell, 1844-1890. He ran toward love, not away from fear. Sarah Henderson. Mitchell, 1844-1890. She chose truth over safety. The story could have ended there, 2 graves in California, far from the Texas that had tried to destroy them. But stories have a way of traveling, of refusing to stay buried. In the 1920s, a young historian researching frontier marriages discovered their story through old court records and Captain Hartwell's private journals. She wrote about them, and others picked up the tale: the Comanche warrior and the white widow who defied everything their world told them was possible. Over the decades, their story grew, was told and retold, became legend. Some versions were accurate, others wildly embellished. But at the heart of every telling was the same truth: that love is always an act of rebellion against a world that wants to divide us into categories and keep us there. In 1967, a delegation of Comanche elders came to California to visit the graves. They performed a ceremony honoring Tamakera as a bridge walker, someone who'd tried to help his people navigate the impossible transition from free nations to reservation life. They left beadwork and sage, symbols of recognition and respect. In 1990, exactly 100 years after Sarah and Tamakera's deaths, a group of historians and activists held a memorial service at the graves. They spoke about the courage it took to love across boundaries, about the price both had paid for choosing each other, about how their story still mattered in a world still struggling with the same questions of identity, belonging, and who gets to decide which loves are legitimate. The graves are still there in that quiet valley in Northern California. Visitors still come, some out of historical interest, some because they see their own struggles reflected in that old story, some because they need to believe that love can triumph even when the whole world says it's impossible. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the light hits the cottonwoods just right, locals swear you can see 2 figures sitting by the nearby creek, a man and a woman, teaching each other, learning from each other, choosing each other over and over again in defiance of every boundary the world tried to build between them. Their graves are in California, yes, but their story lives wherever someone chooses love over fear, truth over safety, connection over the convenient lie of separation. 2 graves in California. But the love they represent, that's still alive, still teaching, still showing us that the categories we build to divide humanity are never as strong as the bridges we can build to connect it. If you watch this far, it's because you felt something real in this story. It's because you understand that love has always required courage, and probably always will. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really connects with the stories on this channel. And before you go, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this, stories about real people making impossible choices in the face of a world trying to break them, these stories matter. They remind us that we're capable of more courage than we think, more love than seems possible, more connection than the world tells us we're allowed to have. Give this video a thumbs up if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that choosing love over fear is always worth it. 2 graves in California, 2 lives lived fully, 1 story that refuses to die. That's what truth does. It survives.